There is a city in Russia called Volgograd. It sits on the banks of the Volga River, from which it takes its current name. Before 1961, the same city was called Stalingrad, from which it takes the name that most of the world still associates with it. The Battle of Stalingrad, the turning point of the Second World War, the city that cost 1.8 million casualties and took 199 days to decide. Before 1925, the same city was called Tsaritsyn. That name is Tatar. It means town on the river Tsaritsa, from the Turkic Sari Su, meaning yellow water. The city was named in 1589 for the golden sands visible where the river Tsaritsa flows into the Volga. The Tatar name encoded something real about the landscape. It preserved, in the form of a place name, a piece of information about the color of a river in a particular season, at the point where two rivers meet, as seen by the people who had lived there long enough to notice. In 1925, that information was replaced by a politician's name. In 1961, when the politician fell from favor, the politician's name was replaced by a river's name, but not the river that had originally named the city. The Tsaritsa was gone. The Volga remained. The landscape remembers the Tsaritsa. The map does not. This is a small example of a very large operation. Between 1917 and 1991, the Soviet state renamed approximately half of all populated places in the USSR. Of the roughly 709,000 populated places in the Soviet Union, perhaps 350,000 changed their names, some once, some multiple times. Cities, rivers, mountains, lakes, streets, squares, institutions, factories, the entire named landscape of 1/6 of the Earth's surface was systematically overwritten. The overwriting was not random. It followed a logic. The old names were connected to the old world, to saints, to czars, to indigenous languages, to the people who had lived in a place long enough to give it a name that described what it was. The new names were connected to the New World, to Lenin, to Stalin, to Marx, to Engels, to the abstract nouns of communist ideology: freedom, red, October, victory, progress. What the new names erased was not just history, it was geography. A place name is a compressed archive. When you rename the river, you do not merely rename it. You erase the record of what the landscape looked like to the people who first named it. And records erased from a landscape are among the hardest to recover, because they were never written down. They were simply there, in the sound of the name, until the sound was changed. Here is what the history books tell us. The Soviet renaming program was a political project. After the October Revolution of 1917, the Bolsheviks needed to remake the symbolic landscape of the former Russian Empire. Cities named after czars and saints carried the ideological freight of the old order. Petrograd, St. Peter's city, became Leningrad. Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad. Yekaterinburg became Sverdlovsk. Nizhny Novgorod became Gorky. The textbooks treat this as ideology made visible, the literal inscription of communist values onto the physical landscape. And they are right, as far as they go. The textbook account ends there. But here is what the textbooks are quieter about. The Soviet renaming program had several distinct phases, and they did not all work the same way. The first phase, in the 1920s under the policy of Korenizatsiya, indigenization, actually moved in the opposite direction from what most people assume. The Soviet state in this period restored non-Russian, non-Slavic names to cities and regions in Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the non-Russian republics. Indigenous and ethnic minority names were reinstated as a symbolic recognition of the formerly oppressed nationalities. Then came the second phase, Stalinization, in which the indigenous names that had been restored were often replaced again with Russian names or names honoring Soviet figures. and then de-Stalinization, which removed Stalin's name from places, but often replaced it with other Soviet names rather than returning the original indigenous name. The result, by the time of the Soviet dissolution, was a landscape that had been written over multiple times: the original indigenous name, then the Tsarist name, then the Korenizatsiya-era restored name, then the Stalinist name, then the de-Stalinization name. Some places had cycled through 4 or 5 official names within a single human lifetime. But here is the thing the textbooks almost never say. Most of the original names, the names that preceded all the Soviet-era changes, were not Russian names. They were Tatar names, Kazakh names, Uzbek names, Evenk names, Yakut names, Bashkir names. Names in languages that had been in those places long before the Russian Empire arrived. When Tsaritsyn was renamed Stalingrad, it was not a Russian name being replaced by a Soviet name. It was a Tatar name, a name that carried, in its sounds, geographical information about a specific landscape feature visible at a specific location, being replaced first by a Tsar-adjacent Russian name, then by a Soviet politician's name. The information in the Tatar name was erased in 1925. It has not been restored. The city is now called Volgograd. The river Tsaritsa still flows through it. The golden sand still visible where it meets the Volga. The map no longer knows what they are called. To understand what a place name actually is, you have to understand what it takes to make one. A place name is not a label attached to a location. A place name is the product of long inhabitation, of generations of people interacting with a specific piece of landscape, noticing its features, developing a vocabulary for what they observe, and encoding that observation into a name that can be transmitted to the next generation without any map or document. The name Tsaritsa, yellow water, describes the color of a specific river at a specific season. Someone had to be there long enough to see the golden sands in the riverbed. Someone had to have the linguistic resources to describe that color. Someone had to pass the name to someone else, and they to someone else, until it was stable enough to be called a place name. The time required to produce a reliable place name is measured in generations. The time required to erase a place name is measured in an administrative decree. The Soviet Toponymic program operated on 3 levels of erasure, each with a different target. The first level targeted the religious and imperial. The saintly prefixes, Sankt, Sviato, Bogoroditsk, were stripped. Cities named for the Romanov dynasty were renamed. The sacred geography of Russian Orthodoxy, accumulated over centuries in the names of thousands of cities and villages, was systematically overwritten. Sviatoy Crest, Holy Cross, became Budanovsk. Bogoroditsk, Mother of God, survived on paper, but lost its religious resonance as its churches were closed and its meaning disconnected from the life of the community. The second level was more consequential and less noticed. It targeted the indigenous. Across the non-Russian republics of the Soviet Union, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Armenia, and across the vast indigenous regions of Siberia and the Russian Far East, place names in indigenous languages were replaced with Russian language names or with Soviet ideological names in the late Stalin period. The Evenk place names of Siberia, the Yakut place names of the far northeast, the Kazakh names of the steppe, the Uzbek names of Central Asia. Each of these name systems was the product of centuries of people observing a specific landscape in a specific language. Each encoded information about the landscape, the color of a river, the shape of a mountain, the behavior of animals at a particular location, that the replacing Russian or Soviet names did not and could not carry. When a Kazakh village named for the quality of its water source was renamed October Village, or Progress Village. The administrative map became disconnected from the actual landscape. The third level was the personal. Cities were renamed after living and dead Soviet leaders, after Lenin, Stalin, Sverdlov, Kirov, Kalinin, Kuibyshev, Ordzhonikidze, Molotov. This created a category of place name that was inherently unstable, because the political fortunes of the named person determined the name's permanence. Stalingrad was renamed Volgograd in 1961 as part of de-Stalinization. Sverdlovsk was renamed Yekaterinburg in 1991. Leningrad was renamed Sankt-Peterburg in 1991, after 54% of residents voted for the change in a citywide referendum. But the original Tatar name Tsaritsyn was not restored to Volgograd. The landscape memory that the name carried, the color of the river, the golden sands, was not considered in the political calculation. The political calculation considered only which Soviet name was politically acceptable to remove and what to replace it with. The indigenous name was not part of the discussion. This asymmetry is the most important feature of the Soviet toponymic program that textbooks miss. The names that were restored after 1991 were predominantly Russian names. Names from the pre-Soviet Russian period, not names from the pre-Russian indigenous period. Leningrad became Sankt Peterburg, a name given by a Russian Tsar in Dutch after a German saint. Not a Finnish name, not an Ingrian name, not a name that carried the memory of the landscape before the Russian Empire arrived. The Soviet overriding was undone only partially. The indigenous overriding, which preceded the Soviet overriding by centuries, was not undone at all. The map was restored to 1914, not to 1614. The landscape memory beneath that layer remains invisible. The Soviet toponymic program was the largest single renaming operation in history, but it was not the only one. The renaming of landscapes has been a consistent feature of every colonial and imperial project, because renaming a landscape is one of the most effective ways to claim it. You do not need to physically occupy every square kilometer of a territory to possess it. You need the map to say that it is yours, and the map says what you name it. In Australia, the colonization of the continent produced a systematic replacement of Aboriginal place names with English names. Some estimates suggest that perhaps 10,000 to 20,000 Aboriginal place names existed across the continent before European colonization. Of these, a small fraction survive on official maps. The rest were replaced by names honoring British royalty, British explorers, British settlers, or British administrative categories. The Aboriginal names encoded knowledge of the landscape, water sources, safe paths, seasonal migrations of animals, sites of cultural significance. The English names encoded the knowledge of the colonizers, who had been there first among Europeans, which governor they wanted to honor, which distant city they had come from. The landscape memory of 40,000 years of Aboriginal inhabitation was not erased in the landscape. The landscape still holds it, but it was erased from the administrative map, and the administrative map is what is taught in schools, what appears on road signs, what is used to navigate, what is transmitted to the next generation. In the United States, the same pattern operated across the continent. The names given by indigenous peoples to rivers, mountains, and places, names that frequently encoded navigational information, ecological knowledge, and cultural memory, were replaced by European names or romanticized approximations of indigenous names, stripped of their original meaning. The Mississippi River takes its name from the Anishinaabe Mississippi, Great River. The name survives. The meaning of the name has been detached from any living relationship with the Anishinaabe people and the knowledge system that produced it. In Africa, the colonial renaming of the continent created a landscape that was navigable by Europeans and disconnected from the indigenous knowledge systems that the original names preserved. The Belgian Congo became Zaire, became the Democratic Republic of Congo. 3 names in a century, each encoding a different political claim on the same territory. The landscape beneath all 3 names, unchanged and unnamed in the language of the people who live in it. In Turkey, as we examined in a previous episode, more than 12,000 Kurdish, Armenian, Greek, and Arabic place names were replaced with Turkish names between 1940 and 1980. The pattern across all these cases is the same. A political authority claims a landscape. The existing names, which carry the memory of the people who lived there before the claim, are replaced by names that carry the memory of the claiming authority. The landscape itself is unchanged. The map is everything. And the map, once it is stable for 2 or 3 generations, becomes the reality that children learn in school. The new names become natural. The old names become history. And then they become forgotten. The mechanism of toponymic erasure operates through a specific sequence that makes it very difficult to reverse. The first stage is administrative. A government authority issues a decree renaming a place. The new name appears in official documents, in the census, in tax records, in legal titles, in military maps. The old name disappears from the official record. The second stage is educational. Children learn the new name in school. The maps in their textbooks show the new name. The official history of the place uses the new name. Within a generation, the new name is not experienced as a change. It is simply the name. The third stage is social. People who knew the old name die. The old name is no longer in active use in any official domain. It survives only in the memories of the elderly, in old books, in family stories, in the private sphere, exactly where administrative language policy confines the things it wishes to diminish. The fourth stage is the absence of restoration. This is the most important stage, and it is not a stage that happens. It is a stage that doesn't happen. After the Soviet dissolution, a toponymic movement emerged across Russia and the former Soviet republics. The movement began under Gorbachev, paralleling glasnost and perestroika. It demanded the restoration of historical names, Leningrad to Sankt-Peterburg, Gorky to Nizhny Novgorod, Sverdlovsk to Yekaterinburg, Tver, which had been Kalinin, Vyatka, which had been Kirov. The movement was partially successful. Major cities with prominent pre-Soviet Russian names recovered them. But the toponymic movement had a fundamental limitation. It was a Russian movement, operating within a Russian cultural framework, restoring Russian names. The Tatar name Tsaritsyn was not on its agenda. The Kazakh names of Kazakhstan were addressed by Kazakhstani authorities, with uneven results. The Evenk and Yakut names of Siberia received almost no consideration in the toponymic restoration. The restoration of the Soviet-era overwriting proceeded along the same political lines as the original overwriting. The language of the dominant group was treated as the default historical baseline, and the indigenous languages beneath it were not considered part of the history being restored. This means that the toponymic landscape of Russia and the former Soviet states today is a palimpsest with a missing bottom layer. The Soviet names are being removed. The pre-Soviet Russian and Tsarist names are being restored. The pre-Russian indigenous names are not being discussed. The erasure that happened over the longest time, the replacement of indigenous names by Russian names beginning in the 16th century, is the erasure that the toponymic restoration is not addressing. And here is the specific technical problem that makes this restoration even more difficult than the political will would require. Many of the original indigenous names were never written down. They existed only in oral tradition, passed from generation to generation, without the alphabet and the document that would have preserved them in a form accessible to a government commission. The Soviet alphabetization of minority languages, which happened in the 1920s and was then disrupted by alphabet changes, created written records of some indigenous languages. But the place name knowledge encoded in those languages predated the alphabetization and was not systematically recorded. You cannot restore what was never written down and is no longer remembered. The landscape remembers. The map does not. And the generation that could tell you what the map forgot grows smaller every year. In Siberia, there is a river. On the current official map, it has a Russian name. Before the Soviet period, it had a different Russian name. Before the Russian name, it had a name in an indigenous Siberian language, a name that described the quality of the water, or the behavior of the fish at a certain season, or the shape of the riverbank at the point where people most reliably crossed. That name is either not known or not recorded. There is an old woman who lives near the river. She is in her 80s. Her grandmother knew the river by a different name, a name in a language that was not Russian, a name that described something specific about the river that the current official name does not. When she dies, that name will be gone, not burned, not banned, simply no longer carried by any living person. This is the final stage of toponymic erasure, not the administrative decree, not the educational system, but the last speaker of the old name, the terminal speaker of a place name. The Soviet Union renamed approximately half of all populated places on 1/6 of the Earth's surface. Between 1917 and 1991, the named landscape of the largest country in the world was systematically overwritten. Some names once, some names multiple times, each overwriting, adding another layer to the palimpsest and making the original layer harder to reach. After 1991, a portion of the overwriting was undone. The names most prominently restored were the names that were most prominently missed. The major Russian cities, whose pre-Soviet names were well documented, well known, and well remembered. The names least prominently restored were the names that had been missing the longest, the indigenous names that the Russian Empire had replaced centuries before the Soviets ever arrived. The toponymic restoration of 1991 moved the baseline of official memory from 1991 to approximately 1914. The 300 years before 1914 and the thousands of years before the Russian Empire remain on most maps unnamed in any indigenous language. When you look at a map today, any map in any country, you are looking at a document that encodes the memory of whoever has most recently had the power to name things. That person was not the first person to live there. That person was not the person who looked at the river and watched the golden sand move in the current and named the color what they saw. The map tells you what the place is called. It does not tell you what the place was called before the people who made the map arrived, or what it was called before the people before them, or what it was called by the person who first stood at the bend in the river in a season we cannot name, in a year we cannot calculate, and said, in a language that may no longer exist, "This is what I see. This is what I will call it. This is the name I will give, so that the next person who stands here will know what I knew. The river remembers. We have forgotten how to ask it.